In the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, Amen. Jesus' advice about where to sit at banquets dredges up lots of awkward moments for us. I'm wagering, at least, that like me, you've had the experience of starting to sit at a table with people you'd really like to be around, only to be told that the remaining seats are already reserved for others. So we learn to ask first, something like, is it okay if I sit here? Then, if all the other seats are reserved, at least you're not embarrassed. And sometimes people even try to make extra room for one more chair. Awkwardness avoided. It's well-established practical advice just about anybody could have come up with. In fact, Jesus might simply be reinterpreting a saying from the book of Proverbs. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. Substitute the wedding party for nobility, and you've got Jesus' version. It's established, practical advice. But of course, Jesus isn't satisfied with a bit of established, practical advice. He's just warming up to offer a bit of subversive, impractical advice. In fact, ludicrous advice. When you give a dinner, he says, don't invite friends or family or people who might return the favor and help you get ahead. Instead, invite people who may never be in a position to invite you back or to lend you any help. Invite the people you hadn't thought about putting on your guest list, the people those of us who are well off tend to overlook. Stop calculating how this might benefit you and learn to be extravagant. Ludicrous advice. Now, true, Jesus does mention that if you do this, you'll get repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. But even back then, people understood that Jesus wasn't talking about getting repaid in any kind of currency you could deposit in the bank. Remember, Jesus is talking about banquets here, and his listeners knew that he pictured the resurrection in terms of bringing every one of us in the fullness of time to feast at the banquet prepared from the foundation of the world. So our repayment at the resurrection is our getting a seat at God's table, where each of us is just as close to God as anybody else. That's the repayment or reward each of us is really longing for, underneath all our jostling for social status. Of course, that's not going to feel very rewarding if we're not ready to sit down and rub shoulders with the people we avoid and the people we overlook. So Jesus is telling us to try reaching out here and now to the people we call those people, because if we are not at home rubbing shoulders with people we have discounted, we're not going to be at home at this final banquet either. During this in-between time in our search for a new rector, I hear these words of Jesus as a charge for us to remember our best moments in the history of All Saints. Like any parish, we've had lots of moments when we weren't at our best, and we'll have lots more. But we've also had and still have moments where Jesus' subversive, impractical advice became flesh and blood here at 16th and Central. Father Gordon published a comprehensive history of All Saints up to the time he became rector, and I've been rereading that during this interim. I think there are still copies in the parish hall if anybody wants to buy them. They're available on Amazon too. We started out in the early 1860s with a different name, Grace Church, and we weren't located here. Even in those early years, we had begun a revolutionary practice. Get ready to be amazed. We offered free seating. That's right. The common practice in Episcopal churches at the time was to gain extra financial support by renting pews to well-off families. Talk about seats of honor. Jump ahead to 1910, after Grace Church had become Grace Cathedral and had seen its modest frame structure physically moved to 16th and Central. That's when the cornerstone was laid here for what would become the Cathedral Church of All Saints, and its statutes of governance contained this declaration: "The Cathedral Church of All Saints shall ever be a house of prayer where all persons of whatever race or nation may have the opportunity to worship God." I don't know if anybody back then paid very much attention to the phrase "of whatever race or nation," but it's there at the very beginning of this structure. We do know that most of the diocese simply assumed that African American Episcopalians would continue to attend St. Philip's. It wasn't until the late 50s that this assumption was challenged. There was actually some controversy in the early 60s at Christ Church Cathedral, which of course means that we were no longer the cathedral at that time. Major donors threatened to withhold pledges when the cathedral began to integrate. But Eli Lilly stepped in and offered to cover any shortfall in the budget, and that was that, at least at the cathedral. We don't know the exact date when All Saints began to integrate, but when Father Gordon wrote his history, nobody remembered any controversy. And we have some gaps in our parish rosters from around that time, but we do know that by 1960, several African American families were listed, and some were assuming leadership roles. So All Saints was at least beginning to live in fits and starts into its original resolve to be a house of prayer for all people. This period might be a good time, by the way, to watch or rewatch the honest documentary of our not always consistent racial history, what we have done and what we have left undone. It's available on the website, and I do recommend watching it, and actually rewatch it if you've seen it before. Our memories could use some jogging. I'd like to think that the parish itself wanted to move in this direction, but it's hard to say, because we were being nudged in that direction by the diocese. All Saints had reached a point where it wasn't clear that we could afford a full-time rector. Sounds a little bit familiar. A consultant was called in who gave us several options. We decided not to move to another neighborhood. Instead, we opted to call a rector, Father Frank Carthy, who would be partly paid by the diocese and other grant money to direct a variety of social outreach agencies housed on the property of All Saints. During Father Carthy's time, there were actually 3 agencies housed here: the Christian Social Relations Department, the Urban Mission Council, and Episcopal Community Services. These agencies overlapped, and so did their funding. Their impact on All Saints was to make us known to ourselves and others as an outward-looking parish. And those who were most involved at the time were willing to embrace controversy for the sake of how they understood the gospel. So speaking of embracing controversy, it's no surprise that right here, the Reverend Jackie Means became the first woman to be canonically ordained in the Episcopal Church. We lost members over that, more than just a few. It's also not that much of a surprise that shortly afterwards, Father Jack Eastwood would welcome two priests recently fired after coming out, Father Gordon and Father Tom. And we lost more than just a few members over that as well. But we were starting to realize that if we were going to call ourselves a house of prayer for all people, we had to live into that, even if it was financially risky. In the 1980s, we lived into our description, a house of prayer for all people, by allowing a rapidly growing number of homeless people to sleep in our pews. Partly because of our practice then, the diocese turned our parish hall on the south side into the Dayspring Center. They built us a smaller parish hall on the north side. True, some of us grumbled over the loss of that building. But at the time, we didn't really have enough members to make good use of it or to maintain it. And then, of course, we became known as the parish who welcomed people with AIDS, coping with our grief over one loss after another, with some glorious Anglo-Catholic funerals, and starting the practice of prayers for healing during communion. Among those whom we lost were our rector, Father Wayne Hansen, and his partner, Father Don Melvin. But somehow we kept going. I could go on, but this was the story of All Saints I began to hear when I first started attending in the late 1990s, when Father Gordon was the rector. I'm pretty sure other people who showed up more recently would notice turning points just as significant as the ones I've mentioned. But to me, everything looks like the unfolding of an identity I had discovered to my deep appreciation back then. So I'll end the history lesson here before I try your patience any further. Partly out of conviction and partly out of the pressure of circumstances, we became a community who kept hosting a kind of banquet for people who felt unwelcome or discounted elsewhere. It's practically become written into our communal DNA. Our surrounding neighborhood has begun to change. It's way more gentrified than it had been in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. But I keep hearing the same story from people who show up and decide to stay. They found a welcome here that's not always easy to find, and a connection with a welcoming God they might not have known they were looking for. I am not suggesting that we pat ourselves on the back for that, because we've stumbled into that role just as often as we chose it. But whether by choice or by accident, we were and are beginning to live into Jesus' subversive, impractical, downright ludicrous advice. It's our distinctive calling here to keep hosting banquets of a sort for people who are not going to help us get ahead, and to discover God hosting that banquet with us. We, of course, can't afford to lose track of where the funding will come from. So be patient about that when you hear updates about the budget, and keep asking what you're able to do in response. But we have no right to seek funding if we lose track of what it's for. Not just a house of prayer, but a house of prayer for all people. Jesus' advice is subversive, impractical, downright ludicrous, just like God's relentless embrace of each of us, no matter what. May we open ourselves to that embrace as we open our common life to a world longing for welcome. Amen.